Good morning, everyone, and welcome again to another Nozomi Thought Leadership webinar. Today, we're exploring serious workplace accidents and their connection to cybersecurity. And I'd like to acknowledge the excellent activities that Nozomi Networks do right here in Australia, APAC, and around the world. And just to acknowledge that it's encouraging to see an organisation that is committed to thinking about what's happening today, but more importantly, what's happening tomorrow, and how do we position ourselves? I love that whole focus on proactivity. It's brilliant. So well done, Nozomi, and we continue to enjoy your support and your thought leadership mindset for sessions such as this. And I want to thank all the audience out there for actually taking the time in your day, because everyone's got busy schedules. We're coming up to Christmas, and it's wonderful that you see the value in these events, that you can share that time with us. If I could introduce you to our panel today, it is we have retired Lieutenant Colonel Bill Hagestead II, as you've probably seen Bill before, expert in Chinese cyber espionage and extraordinary man of wisdom and the dark arts. We also have Professor Jonathan Rush, former federal prosecutor of the US Department of Justice, former chair of the Presidential Identity Theft Committee, I said prosecutor, I think he was co-chair of the International Mass Marketing Fraud Working Group, and he carries a great burden of being an overachiever, for which I'm absolutely jealous. And we also have with us Trevor Little, workplace and risk management expert. Trevor is highly qualified in his previous experience working for litigation lawyers of the Queensland regulator, overseeing workplace incident investigations and matters finalised in the industrial courts here in Australia, and particularly Queensland.
Hello, everyone.
So, gentlemen, welcome to this conversation this morning, and it is a conversation. And, you know, it came out of the fact that we're starting to see the emergence of regulatory legislation holding different parts of the industries, different levels, boards, executives, more personally accountable for different events. And we look at how digital transformation, which is being rapidly applied, especially this year, 2020, because of COVID. And I question whether many organizations are now actually thinking how converged the technology is with their physical day-to-day activities. And, you know, we've had some serious workplace incidents, and I'll get you to talk shortly, Trevor, about new legislation in Australia that has emerged and is continuing to emerge that holds the boards accountable for serious industrial accidents, such as, coined the term, industrial manslaughter. So to me, this is all about convergence. So how do you feel about that? Have you seen it on the other side of the world, guys? I mean, is convergence from all these different, once disparate parts of an organization's operation, it's all coming together because of technology, is it not?
I definitely think that's the case, Brian. I think that for all of the logic that I think many organizations have applied in thinking we need to connect more parts of our enterprise, we need to have greater connections between, you know, not just traditional IT networks, but operational networks, IoT, etc. I think there's often a sort of a default mode of thinking more connections are better, broader connections to the internet are better. But the broader those connections, the more access points that gives dedicated cyber attackers, whether they're state actors or longtime professional criminal networks of cyber attackers. It gives them more access points and allows them to reach beyond just traditional IT resources, you know, the traditional mode of looking for data that they can download, you know, espionage they can conduct, and look for ways to go after directly operational technology and operational systems. And that's exactly the kind of thing that can lead to much greater impact, even catastrophic impact on the systems at major enterprises.
Yeah, and look, for the audience, it was remiss of me, I apologize, but if you have any questions, please throw them through into the questions box, and we will attempt to answer them along the way. If we don't, we will answer those questions post the conclusion of the webinar and get you that information. So do you think convergence has actually um, been faster this year because of COVID-19?
I think it has, Brian. To one of Jonathan's points, the greater connectivity we have, and especially now that we're in this pandemic age, which doesn't look like it's going to abate anytime soon, the threat surface is actually increased tenfold, if not more than that. And the old principles of governance, risk, and compliance are essentially now just buzzwords. I think there was actually a hedge fund there in Australia in September that was hacked from taking advantage of some of those active endpoint accesses, essentially basically bypassing the compliance rules from the outside and essentially tricking the systems internal to the hedge fund to release upwards of $8 million, of which only 1.9 million was actually captured by the malicious individual. So yes, the more connected we are, the greater the threat surface, absolutely.
You know, when you say $1.9 million like that, it just seems like it was just small change, but that's a lot of money if it's going into the crooks, right? And
well,
I
they
think
tried at 8 million, yes.
So we have Convergence, and everyone, you know, this year has really sort of hammered forward with getting remote enablement, for example. And really, am I wrong to suggest that the governance and compliance issues is always in catch-up mode because they've got to enable first, then they'll think about the possible negative consequences, then they'll secure it, and then we'll get into a compliance regime at the back end. That seems to be the normal way we approach, is it not?
Sad to say, I think that's true. And I think to one of Bill's points, I think part of the problem is that COVID forced organizations of all sizes around the world to switch hastily into using Zoom or whatever, larger scale communications software and platforms are available without knowing that they had comparable security for the use of those same systems. And I think a lot of organizations understand they have played catch up. Things like Zoom bombing and other low-level cyber attacks gradually got it across to a lot of information security professionals that they really need to think about how these networks need to be secured. That doesn't address the larger issue of what technology executives, managers, lower-level employees are using from home. And you literally do not have anywhere near the level of oversight that's possible when you have everyone in the same building with the same technology. We're all in short, working from home without the same capacity to be able to use more effective cybersecurity measures. And, as the old saying goes, the weakest link is the one that's likely to break. So those that are using technology from home where their enterprises haven't said, you must do this, you must download this kind of security software and so on, will be, and already have been, providing multiple access points for cyber attackers of many colors.
So you played in the legislative space for a very long time, Jonathan. I mean, why does it take the regulators so long? Why does it take someone to lose a life or suffer a serious industry? Then it takes the media to speculate and put it on the front page before we get any sense of a regulatory requirement that says this is the minimum standards you got to have?
In a sense, Brian, I think it comes back to sort of fundamental priorities. Unless you have an organization that from the top down is dedicated to and understands how dynamic and how complex the task of maintaining cybersecurity is, they're going to operate in a business as usual mode, until they are struck in the face with something that literally requires them to respond. It's easy to say, okay, you're telling me about these difficulties, but I've got other priorities. I've got other needs. I mean, one thing that's particularly worrisome from the standpoint of thinking about, industrial accidents and potential catastrophe, there was a survey done earlier this year by an information security firm. It looked at 100 of the world's largest airports, and it found that 97% of them had some fundamental flaws in their cybersecurity. So it's not difficult to imagine what could happen if really hostile actors decide, for example, to disable air traffic control systems or other critical communications networks that are vital to air traffic, both nationally and internationally. And yet, because there's been no massive catastrophe that stems from a cyber attack, everyone thinks, well, I've got other priorities. I've got to deal with the priorities in front of me. And it becomes quite easy, frankly, to say the low probability, high catastrophe potential kinds of accidents are not something I have to worry about. I don't have time. I don't have the resources.
It's interesting. Sometimes it's intended and sometimes it isn't. I remember Eugene Kaspersky at an OSCERT conference maybe a decade ago talked about how a virus was inadvertently loaded onto an airliner that took off from perhaps Madrid. And then because of that virus, crashed and killed about 127 or 227 people, and that wasn't intentional. That was simply a mistake. And of course, most industrial accidents are not intentional; they're a mistake. And we've had an issue recently in Queensland, which got a lot of publicity here in Australia. And Trevor, maybe you'd like to just give an insight into the Dreamworld.
Just quickly, Brian, just adding on to what Jonathan said, listening, whether it's cyber or any industry, we tend to always be reactive, not proactive. We don't tend to look into the future. We tend to act on what's already occurred. And very much to do with governing, managing risk compliance in my time, I'm finding that we're spending money, we're putting in training, we're putting in technology, we're rectifying defects as a result of something that's occurred. We tend to never address something before it happens. And the biggest thing with with what's happened in Queensland due to a mobile fatality on a ride at a theme park back in October 2016 was a multitude of systemic failures in relation to maintenance, safety measures, construction, training, and so on. And they were all preventable. And
I mean, that incident you're talking about wasn't, of course, connected to any OT or IT environment, but the convergence factor and how it plays out today, tomorrow, and the next number of years, it eventually will. I think there's a reasonable expectation that it will. And so
definitely.
What's
occurring now is a major grocery chain in Australia, one of the big two, is being reported through the media that it's in the process of automating all its warehouses void of any human contact. In other words, their manual workforce is being retrenched. That in itself, buddy, brings in the issues of IT and AI and exposure to cyber. And when we ask ourselves, what are the cyber safety risks?
I mean, we look at the Dreamworld tragedy, and we have a situation. Let's posit that those rides are connected through an OT network. And overlaying that is an IT environment that actually, for efficiency and control and visibility purposes, makes it function, can keep, CCTV cameras and manage it all together. And this is all going to happen. Then to you, Bill, does that make it an attractive target for a nefarious third party, be they a nation-sponsored threat environment, be it a hacktivist, be it a cyber criminal?
Well, absolutely. It really depends on the motivation of the threat actor and what is the gain for them. When you take a look at the big four that we recognize here in the United States as the nefarious nation states, certainly that list includes Russia, Islamic Republic of Iran, the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, and the Chinese. Regarding the Chinese specifically, a country near and dear to my research and experience, the NSA released about a month ago a list of over 25 vulnerabilities associated with a variety of technologies that enterprise Internet of Things and endpoint technology companies are using, from manufacturing to healthcare. What's interesting about that, to answer your question, Brian, is that there are vulnerabilities out there that can be exploited at the time and place of their choosing, which leads it back to one of Jonathan's points and Trevor's, is that as we start to see more connectivity and using some of these common products, the vulnerabilities within the communication stack is wide open for anyone to exploit at any time. The fact that our National Security Agency listed these vulnerabilities across a wide range of technology vendors should be a wake-up call, and it's perhaps actual information for the listeners to this webinar today, and perhaps taking a look at that list and what they have within their enterprise networks may be a good place to start to perhaps avoid any sort of future compromise by any nation-state actor, regardless of their motivations.
Yeah, I'll come back to that. if I may, thanks, Bill. Trevor, we touched on the dream world, and that gave rise to a lot of attention around industrial manslaughter laws. And that seeks to hold the board accountable for these issues. Is that correct?
Yeah, basically, yeah, to just give you a rundown for our viewers, is very much back in the early in the century, in 2011, we had what we call the Workplace Health and Safety Acts, or harmonisation laws, and there was a census instead of each state in Australia having its own safety laws and procedures, etc., that we have harmonisation laws. And between 2011 2012, most Australian territories and states implemented these laws, except for Victoria and Western Australia. Western Australia, I do believe, is in the process of introducing these laws, with the industrial manslaughter to be drafted in the laws as I speak this year. What we found with the multiple fatalities that occurred is, in the investigations, was that the boards and the senior officers and executives were found to be wanting, that they were told that things had to be done. They ignored internal advice. They never got external maintenance carried out on the equipment. There were previous failures on the equipment that wasn't properly investigated or inspected. And basically what occurred was, well, nothing's happened in the last 20 years, so steady as she goes. I could go into a number of issues that did occur, but probably in the forum if anyone wants to put in a question. But ideally what's come out of this is boards are accountable. Boards and senior executives are accountable for what happens within their workplace.
So we're talking about accountability in terms of criminal and civil litigation. Accountability.
Correct.
So they could, a board member, if shown to be negligible, refusing the advice, can find themselves in a courtroom being personally on trial.
If each and every element of an offence can be proven beyond reasonable doubt, definitely proved beyond reasonable doubt. What's happened though in New South Wales is that they've actually drafted legislation that indemnity insurance is banned, that companies and individuals, executives and senior officers who previously, and I've got matters here I could refer to comments made by the court, where indemnity insurances can't be used to pay any fines that are incurred or handed down both in the criminal court, or what I'm probably more concerned about is how directors and boards are exposed civilly. With being exposed the way they are civilly, opens up a hornet's nest.
So let's future-proof this a little bit and extrapolate the argument further. So now we have serious workplace incidents. The legislation is in place that can hold boards and executives criminally and civilly liable without the protection of indemnity directors' insurance.
That is in New South Wales, but I'm looking at common law and being national laws, that is currently in New South Wales. But judging from the way in which the insurance companies generally write national policies, that could affect people in other states as well. But it is
right,
in New South Wales.
And we know this is a this is a moving train, nothing stops. It's all point in time stuff. But from a thought leadership perspective and looking down the track, so now let's accept that there is going to be legislation in place holding potentially board members criminally and civilly liable for industrial manslaughter or serious workplace incidents. Now throw in the next context, if that environment, that workplace environment, as we know one of the big retailers are doing, is controlled by SCADA, OT, IoT and IT systems, and if those systems are breached, then by nature that puts potentially workplace health and safety at risk. Therefore, let me put it to you folks, does that mean cybersecurity and poor cybersecurity of those environments may lead board members and executives criminally and civilly liable for the consequences?
Absolutely, Brian. I think let's war game this for a second if we could. Imagine that you have a oil company that Trevor probably has experience with, or a mining enterprise, and I'm a state-owned enterprise from a country maybe just north of you, for example, in the Southeast Asian area. And I know that if I compromise those executives by attacking and taking advantage of the legislation and the lack of insurance in order to create a situation where you are not only criminally liable, but also economically liable, this is the perfect position in order to gain a market advantage over you and essentially cause you to cease to exist commercially. I think this is something in the future that will indeed happen if it hasn't already happened. Certainly there are case studies out there, but this is one of those future statements that every organization, board of directors, the C-suite should be very concerned about. They can become very much the personal target of a nation state if they are indeed the affection of takeover initiatives.
Like, sorry, Jonathan. Sorry,
yeah.
Trev.
Yeah, sorry. What happens? Sorry, Jonathan. What happens is that currently we always appear to be making catch up with legislation. What my concerns are, automation, the use of the supervisory control and data acquisition systems. That's been around for ages, but with all the new technology, the AI, IT, and what is happening now in the way and workplaces are more and more getting digitalized and getting automated, is that the risks that are the safety risks that are going to come out through cyber attack, we're not going to be prepared. Your general director or your board or your workers not going to understand, not going to be aware or prepared how to handle this.
Yeah,
sorry,
I think
John.
the thing I would add to what Trevor said is certainly I think over here in the United States, and I think this is a general movement that you see in other regions of the world, when it comes to corporate compliance writ large, I think in the last 5 to 6 years particularly, there's been an increasing shift in the mindset and the perceptions of regulators and law enforcement agencies that boards need to be on top of all of their key compliance risks. And that doesn't just get defined in terms of don't bribe foreign public officials, have money laundering controls. Regulators are prepared, broadly speaking, to look at any and every area of regulation for which a corporation, whatever the industry it's in, has to be attentive. So in a situation like this, especially because certainly I've been seeing more and more indications that regulators and criminal enforcement agencies are focusing on key failures by CEOs, CTOs, and board members to pay attention to and keep the cybersecurity of their enterprise in very solid working order. It's, to me, almost a paradigm shift to expect that should something occur as a result of cybersecurity breaches that results in damage to human beings or death of human beings, I don't think it's going to be much of a stretch for regulators and law enforcers to say, similar to the Dreamworld situation, you failed to do this, you ignored these risks, you ignored these issues, something that's systemic in terms of its neglect of the safety of employees, the security of the enterprise, I think increasingly will be bound up as a comprehensive set of bases on which boards can find themselves in very hot water indeed if you do have some kind of industrial manslaughter situation arise as a result of cyber attacks or cyber breaches.
And we've started to see some industry influence and emergence of legislation with APRA in July last year in Australia. It brought in standards that the board of insurance, finance or banking, insurance and insurance companies can no longer abrogate the risk. They are accountable for the cybersecurity risk. They are also accountable for the cybersecurity risks in third-party providers who are holding their data. And so we are seeing a bit of a drive towards that sort of board level accountability. And we've got a question from Jill, and it says, how do we get our top down to understand the importance of cybersecurity and that it should be a priority, not an afterthought? In brackets, I lead cyber risk function in a consumer goods manufacturing company. What advice would you give Jill?
I would suggest, Jill, that perhaps you, number one, educate from the bottom up. Create a security ambassadors program where the education comes from within and bubbles up to the top, essentially creating everyone as a human firewall. Eventually, those executives are going to walk around and ask, what's going on with the clicking of these phishing exercises that we have? But ultimately, strategically, the requirement for you will be asking those board level executives, what within the company, if I were to take away as a foreign nation state hacker or a malevolent criminal, cyber criminal, would cause you to cease operations? Once you answer that question, you must then protect that concept, that intellectual property, that bona fide reason for existing with all your energy and effort. And that's where it comes down to basic good cybersecurity practice and finding trusted partners to help you achieve that end state. Without that, you're attempting to basically patch everything without really knowing what as a hacker, I'm coming after.
I think one other thing I'd add to that, Brian, is that absolutely what Bill said makes perfect sense. You need to have that permeate the enterprise at all levels. So it shouldn't be just some general policy statement issued by C-level officials that we care about cybersecurity and be compliant. You really need to have constantly updated training. I do think, however, that senior executives in legal departments and information security departments need to gather recent examples of the catastrophic effects, at least financially, on organizations that don't pay attention to their own cybersecurity situations. Here in the United States, for example, there are several global recognized financial institutions that have been fined tens, even hundreds of millions of dollars, not because somebody willfully engaged in allowing a cybersecurity breach to happen, but simply because they failed to maintain on a systemic basis adequate internal controls, adequate oversight of what happens when they try to move their IT operations to the cloud, and so on. So I think to the extent you can say this is happening in a very significant way, and clearly Australia itself has had recent examples of catastrophic failures on the money laundering side and the catastrophic effects of having long-term neglect of security. That makes it important to say, here's some bottom line information for you. If we don't make sure that we've got our ducks in a row with regard to cybersecurity, here are the kinds of things that have happened to our competitors in our industry or near competitors in similar industries. I mean, I think things have to be brought home quite forcibly to chief executives and major senior executives to make them realize the world isn't the way they thought it was 10 years ago. The expectations of regulators and law enforcement agencies have risen as their sophistication and understanding cybersecurity has risen.
It is.
And whether or not these people are themselves cybersecurity experts, C-level officials and boards have to be able to demonstrate that they are paying attention to cybersecurity. The consequences for them fiscally and to their organizations can be quite dramatic.
Absolutely, but it's that regulatory compliance regime that can help define that argument for the people. I go into organisations all the time, and I often talk about the why. Why it's, and you come back to the whole issue when you're trying to build the organisational cyber-safe cultures is, if you want to make it important to someone, you've got to make it personal, and you've got to make it relevant. And if you can tick personal relevant, then it becomes important. Sometimes that might be on a back of a compliance regulatory regime. I think when you go in there and you explain why you are a target, why good cybersecurity actually starts at home, not in the workplace this year more than ever, why your government can't stop it, why law enforcement can't do anything about it, why it's your responsibility, why it's actually got to be an endemic part of your culture. And what I do know is that why doesn't get answered enough. So, Jill, we're happy to have more conversations with you afterwards. Trevor, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yes, I just want to add to Jonathan's comments that the key words, and agree totally, but boards and directors never relinquish control. They are accountable, and they need to be aware they're accountable for cyber, they're accountable for workplace practices, they're accountable for the way in which their operation or their organisation or their corporation operates. It's something that they must be, not so much from Jill going up, it must be from them going down the information train.
Yeah, but a lot of them don't understand the accountability factor yet. We're
exactly. That's what my point before, and that's my fear. It's that comes back to the reactive.
Look, just a note from Robert, who was kind enough to do some research whilst he was listening there. I'm impressed. Thanks, Robert. Flight 5022 was the Spanish flight that went down because of a virus that was inadvertently uploaded. Accidentally, not an intended malicious act. Another question from, forgive me if I say this incorrect, Jaco. How many real-world examples are there of cyber-related safety incidents? as there is still a reluctance in the engineering world to accept that increased system connectivity or lack of cybersecurity controls have a safety impact. Well, the whole point, this is thought leadership, Jaco, so let me just say cautiously, this is named because of the convergence factor. This is what I'm very confident we will see an increased occurrence of. So proactively, we're talking about this issue to try and get one step ahead. But if anyone has some comment on that, I'd love to hear it.
Yes, there is a case study actually of a patient in Germany that died as a result of a ransomware attack on a healthcare delivery organization in that country. The resulting delay in care of getting information necessary to adjudicate or diagnose her medical malay led to her having to be transported to another facility. In transit, she of course perished, which is unforgivable. But directly related to that was the ransomware attack that essentially held those records in abeyance. Essentially, they did not have a backup. They did not they were not able to afford the decryption key in time. And of course, the patient died. I think we're going to start to see this more and more, especially as the ICU beds around the world start to fill up even more than they already are. I think we're really at the edge of quite a serious catastrophic issue if we don't get ahead of this.
And I think Bill makes an excellent point here. Up to now, people have looked at ransomware as something that was only something like to have a fiscal impact on the organization at which the ransomware is directed. You know, ransomware, at least in some varieties, is ultimately directed at extortion, good old-fashioned extortion. Pay us or you'll never get access to your systems again. And I think particularly during the COVID pandemic, a lot of the most widely active ransomware groups have been thinking hospitals are cash cows. They can't afford to be out of action, so they're likely to pay quickly. What I foresee is a strong possibility, and sadly, now that we see in the United States, our daily totals of new COVID positive people continuing to spike and spike and spike, and have hospitals stressed to the maximum in multiple states, it only takes the wrong kind of decision by a ransomware group to put pressure on a hospital. And what Bill described happening to that poor woman in Düsseldorf could be multiplied multiple times when hospitals aren't even able to respond to a moderately sophisticated ransomware attack, and more people start dying as a result of the hospital's inability to provide care. That, I think, is a real worry that is on the minds of cybersecurity experts in the United States, and really needs to be in other countries that are experiencing high incidences of COVID.
Well, if we look at when Wannacry hit, and we had 5 major health hospitals in the NHS basically shut down from a cyber perspective. They had to revert back to manual things. Now, how do I say this without sounding like an evil bugger, but there would have been incidents during that process that affected the physical health and well-being of some of those patients who are treated that was disrupted as a consequence that we will never hear of, and we would be remiss not to mention it and ignorant not to accept it. That there are a lot of things that do go on that we never hear about. And Trevor, you would see that in your history back in workplace health and safety.
Yeah.
Most of it's swept under the carpet. We're not going to address it because we've got to acknowledge it. If we acknowledge it, we've got to report it, and then we're going to be in trouble. So
only report the matter when you know you're going to get found out.
Yeah, okay. We've got a question here from a statement and a question from Colin. Where is the government policy to mandate cyber compliance? Focus has been a lot around DSD, Essential 8 and privacy, but there has been any financial penalties because there is not leadership in policy across government levels, public and privacy. For me, one of the issues there is, I think, and if I could start the response to this gentleman, is that I think governments still around the world are still struggling to come to terms with the cyber environment, what it represents, how it permeates and touches every aspect of society. And my biggest issue, I shouldn't say issue, but one of my biggest challenges with government is they tend to view the world in terms of their legislative and geographic border domains, and they don't embrace a more holistic and understand. I remember getting in front of it on stage at an FBI conference and saying law enforcement needs to adopt a culture of a willingness to contribute to the global effort without expectation of return. If we sit here in Australia and say we're going to make Australia safe and think that's all we need to do, we got our heads up our clackers. We need to understand that good cybersecurity has been a good global citizen, and how can we contribute? Now, there are 42 different countries represented on this webinar today. That is a global interest factor. That is outstanding, and congratulations to Nozomi for that. But that typifies the challenge. It's not. How it impacts and affects is maybe a domestic or national issue, but we've got to address this with a global holistic view that we have our global role to play. So I think we are still trying to emerge that level of maturity to understand this challenge, and I've spoken for enough.
I think the challenge, Brian, is that the adversaries don't care. They don't care about the legislation that you're talking about. They don't care about the financial ramifications for corporate entities. They are just looking for that one weak spot in a country, in an infrastructure, in an Internet of Things company that is tied operationally to connected items. And with a specific targeting, it would be very easy for any nation state with motivation, proper training, and resources to make that happen. And they're basically just pushing aside, this global view. The global view needs to be much more comprehensive from a threat information sharing perspective. It needs to be much more holistically understand between law enforcement and military. Here in the United States, for example, the U.S. military does not protect the civilian world in the cyber. They go on the offensive from a military perspective to fix and place the enemy and destroy them and essentially wipe them from the face of the earth in a cyber warfare realm. Theirs is not to protect the infrastructure. The same would be true in Australia. And certainly, I think if there is to be a concerted effort, it has to start with understanding where is the threat coming from, how does it impact my country, how does it impact yours, and how can we work together to share that information once we know that that attack is focused on a vulnerability, so that we can share at least the best practices, so we can enhance our techniques, tactics, and procedures to prevent those attacks from being successful in the face of uncertainty. That's the key to the dilemma that you're talking about.
Yeah. Brian, if I could add one other point, I think it's helpful to focus on the Australia's cybersecurity strategy that the government issued in August of this year, I think. I mean, there are a lot of very broad principles that make perfect sense as to what the government can do. But if you comb through the document, I think you actually find very little recognition of the idea that damage isn't just sort of incidental or moderate in scope. The idea that there could be catastrophic damage inflicted on industrial processes, on businesses, et cetera, it really doesn't enter into the picture. And I don't mean to criticize the survey for trying to be completely comprehensive without turning into a 5,000-page manual. But I do think if you look at the broad principles in the survey itself, perhaps it's important to say we need to look at some of these broad-based principles, the idea of making sure that consumers have more secure Internet of Things and that we do more to help businesses, all true at a very generic level. But I think the idea of implementing the strategy has increasingly to focus on these kinds of more catastrophic situations that can arise, where it's not just information that it's lost, it's damage to physical systems, and as we've been talking about, potentially damage or death for human beings in those environments.
Yep. Okay.
Well, and I'd like to add to that, basically what Jonathan said, very correct, and add to it. My concern is, as within Australia, as we implement technological change, we automate our services and we introduce AI and IT more and more into our systems, how does our average worker on the ground understand the ramifications and the risks that they may be exposed to?
And look, in this country, I can tell you now, most people do not understand the threat nor the risk, and that's, I mean, you people do. You have a much better insight, but you know, I'm out there and going in so many different organisations, and that's why the why is so important. Once you answer the why, then you have an appreciation of the risk, and it doesn't have to be a scary story. It's just a better understanding. We drive a car every day, but do we ever stop to think, well, if I drive that poorly, can I guarantee I'm never going to have an accident? And of course, the answer is no, but you understand the risk, but we still drive cars. That's cool. And just on the issue of AI, we've got a question from Ashley. What is the feeling for the risk exposure by the designers of AI systems? For example, making sure the coding takes into account risk of failure due to cyber attack. How is risk spread across the parties to the failure?
Wow, Ashley, this is a good question. I think clean coding principles of which you are speaking are paramount in any sort of DevSecOps environment, whether the products are medical devices or automotive, as Brian is talking to. The challenge, though, is that is part of the supply chain now. And the artificial intelligence portion of that perhaps may not understand the cyber risks as a human would, as a coder would. And if you are not able to classify the code consistently from a logging and monitoring perspective, then you lose focus on the ball. And again, then it becomes code that is easily manipulated by an adversary or an individual. Artificial intelligence will not be the answer, nor will quantum computing. I don't mean to be a Debbie Downer or rain on the parade, but this is the reality of the world that we live in now.
That Debbie Downer wasn't an old girlfriend of yours, Bill, or anything like that, or not letting any personal secrets out of the bag.
Sir, if you have to ask, then you don't need to know. Sorry.
Oh, maybe it's a rhetorical question.
Indeed.
Brian, on this point, if I can add one point to this, I think Bill has touched on something that may be especially pertinent to our questioners' concerns here. I think up to now, a lot of organizations think in very narrow bands when it comes to thinking about AI. Oh, we need AI to better deal with customer engagement. Oh, we need AI to deal with better control of our ongoing operations and distribution. I think that there's a larger conversation that probably too few organizations have had up to now, which is how do we get all of our AI to talk to each other so that it's not just about getting to our customers better, faster, moving us through a decision tree so we get the right information or improving what we're doing in the supply chain. It's also about if we have AI in place that helps us to detect cybersecurity potential breaches sooner, quicker, how does that information get translated over so that the AI that we have running our supply chain or industrial processes don't continue down a path that leads to inadvertent on the part of the enterprise itself, damage or worse that comes from that. In short, you've got to be thinking about not only the logistics of installing AI and seeing whether your AI is producing results with accuracy, recall, etc., but also are they talking to each other in ways that mutually reinforce the security of the organization? I think, unfortunately, we're still dealing with very stovepiped enterprises, even while they think, oh, we're in the 21st century. We've got AI, we've got machine learning, we've got neural networks. Are you talking to each other within your environment? Because that could itself be a strategic vulnerability, even while you're thinking, but it's state of the art.
And when we get that convergence, there will still be, I can see arguments, oh, that's going to hold us back here because that can't move without that one being in place. So there's still going to be those challenges. And, right. We can put AI in to perform a function, but its optimum performance is still going to be point in time when something is attached to it or evolves over another side that wasn't meant to, be coded into or appreciated when that code was written. So we have all these competing convergence. One of the big issues for me with this convergence is with IoT, OT, IT, and workplace health and safety issues and all the accountability frameworks is we need visibility over those issues. The more you converge, I would suggest the greater the need for that visibility, because otherwise, do you want to look at 10 pictures or do you want to look at 1 or 2 or 3? Your stovepipe analogy, you got to It's not just having the pipe. You got to open it up. You got to look inside. You got to do the analysis. Again, it's a constantly moving train. To me, we're in absolutely the time of chaos, not because of COVID-19, but because of technology and just getting on our lives and this constant improvement to change, improve, evolve, and it's going to be a challenge. And there's not going to be there may be a point-in-time solution, but all those point-in-time solutions are fundamentally going to be short-lived. It's a culture of expectation to constantly improve faster than we perhaps ever appreciated before. So when the board says, right, well, we gave you a budget 3 years ago for $2 million to manage cybersecurity, we're going to give you another $3 million and don't annoy us for another 3 years or whatever. That just doesn't flow anymore. Interesting, Robert shared with us there's a Turkey pipeline explosion was probably cyber. And of course, he reminds us of Stuxnet. Now, what if the Stuxnet malware actually caused a workplace industry when some of the reactors exploded or the turbines, whatever it was that affected? We don't know.
Well, actually, Brian, there have been a couple of really good detailed studies into how Stuxnet operated. And in a way, it's very instructive to think what happens if, as I think we can all fairly assume, there were state actors seeking to neutralize Iran's capacity at the Natanz nuclear facility. The brilliance of the attack in Stuxnet was that not only did they take two different vectors as a means of manipulating the centrifuges, but the attackers were very careful to make sure that they didn't make centrifuges explode. What they did was degrade the performance of the rotors in the centrifuges so that all of the Iranian nuclear engineers were driving themselves crazy. They were thinking, what's wrong with our software? How can we make this fix? We don't know what's going on. If there had been, and this is sort of key to the analysis that I think the cyber attackers used in launching Stuxnet, if they had done something as simplistic as let's blow up the centrifuges, there's evidence that the Iranians already had a whole batch of replacement centrifuges ready to go. So had there been a catastrophic meltdown, if you will, of the centrifuges, the Iranians would have snapped the new centrifuges in place fairly quickly and they would have started up. On the other hand, because so much of the Iranian operation of the centrifuges was kind of cobbled together processes, like one on top of another, they were thinking, what's wrong with this is us. What's wrong with is our software, our processes. And so the net effect was actually to damp down Iran's production of nuclear fuel over a longer period of time and damp down more production than if they'd just blown up the centrifuges. That, I think, is actually a template now for state actors, because if they want to attack industrial systems in a power with which they have some adversarial relationship, I think there's something to be said from the state actors' attacker standpoint. We don't need to blow them up. Let's just make them work in degraded fashion. If we need to send a strategic message. In other words, you only need to put something in place to blow things up if you want that to be basically an act of war. If you're attacking and you want to degrade comprehensively the capacity of that nation to respond.
Sure, and that comes back to Bill's point right at the beginning when he talked about what's the motivation. Because a terrorist group is going to want the explosion, wants the message to get out into the community, to create fear, promulgate their ideology. So there's
Brian,
Stephen.
If I could,
sorry,
just before you take Stephen's question to Jonathan's point about the Natanz centrifuge disruption, which was actually a good oratory. Thank you, sir. Is the unintended consequence of that Stuxnet was the weaponization of malware across the Middle East. There are a variety of case studies that not only affected nuclear reproductive capabilities, but healthcare, oil and gas. Just about every one of the major industries across most of the Middle East were impacted eventually by different types of malware that propagated as a iteration or a variation from the Stuxnet. So it's important for the viewers to understand that those are indeed the unintended consequences of which this whole panel was designed for. is what are some of those industrial accidents that could have happened. And I think we're right on the precipice. If there are not good, back to the simplistic GRC, governance, risk, and compliance rules for the executives to follow. Sorry to interrupt, Brian, but I just thought I would interject that. No pun intended.
It's the first time you've ever apologised for interrupting, Bill. That's
just quickly to add to what everything that Jonathan and Bill said in relation to Stephen's question, but I'll go back to what I've been saying. It's the workplace, the level of knowledge, and what we've just heard. Our workers and the workplace don't have that knowledge. They don't understand, and they are very vulnerable.
And you know, it's one of the to touch on something that was raised before by Colin, I think it was, and it touches back to Jill's point. You know, Australia government policy around a lot of this stuff has always been industry's always lobbied government to a large extent to bring in an I code. And, you know, this is the notion that we will voluntarily comply with this code. But the reality is that doesn't happen, and it doesn't actually get traction until there is legislation in place that makes it part of a compliance regime. And that's sad that that's the case. And Jonathan, you articulated before some of the reasons around that. But it's just the part of the evolutionary bubble that we're in. Stephen says, just for our advice, starting next year, APRA will be asking boards to engage in an external audit firm to conduct a thorough review of their CPS 234 compliance and report back to both APRA and the board. So it's unfortunate we need a compliance regime to do it because it makes good sense, good healthy regime to do it, good hygiene, but it's got to be forced, and it will happen, and there will be positive results, pain in some ways and positive in another. Bruce shares a comment. As a comment, we are now seeing workplace regulators such as SafeWork New South Wales and SafeWork Victoria engaging with the operators of major hazard facilities to query the adequacy and maturity of their industrial control systems, cybersecurity strategy and controls during periodic reviews of safety cases and other such risk management documents. One can well expect it is only a matter of time before we see compliance obligations being considered or introduced in this space. As we've seen in the current proposed amendments for legislation covering cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, and systems of national significance. The legislative changes to critical infrastructure does indeed include penalties for non-compliance, and is most likely as the other regulators such as WorkSafe and SafeWork follow suit. Thanks for sharing that, Bruce. That's great. I mean, and a lot of us are not aware of these things. And I just wonder, going back to Jill's comment right at the beginning, you know, Jill may be able to use that sort of emerging legislative reform or introduction to help to get more traction in some of her arguments with the executive. Aside, here's a question from Mark. Aside from the responsibilities that boards and directors inherently have, are there questions that the customers should be asking to ensure they are dealing with a company that is taking this seriously?
Yes, I think the first question should be, does your enterprise in the products, the services that you produce have vulnerabilities? Are you announcing those in terms of being remediated or fixed with some sort of product security enhancement? If the answer to that is no, then perhaps you should probably look for another partner that does take it more seriously, because that type of remediation of vulnerabilities will be funded directly from the C-suite as well as the board of directors, because they'll sense that there's a legal or reputational and perhaps even a safety issue at hand if those vulnerabilities are not addressed within the products that they produce.
Okay. Any other comment?
Yeah, it comes back to what was said before. In my perspective, everyone has a duty of care and obligation to ensure a safe working environment, and every step should be taken to eliminate or minimise any hazard or risk when any exposure to injury or death in the workplace. It's fundamental. It's fundamental. And I just like quickly, while I could, to go back to Jonathan's comments before when we're talking about boards and directors, how accountable they are. I look at the coronial inquest into this fatality I was talking about, and I'll just quote what the coroner said: how rudimentary and deficient the safety management practices in place at Dreamworld were prior to this tragedy. Such a capable culture can exist only when leadership from the board down are careless with respect to safety. This cannot be allowed. And you can draw that across everything we've spoken about. It's the accountability on boards and senior executives now is higher than ever before. It's the relevance to boards and the decisions making and the foreseeable consequence, looking into the future, what can and what could occur, and putting in steps to eliminate or minimise those risks is paramount. It's essential. And everything I've listened to, we talk into IT unit or to people that have got the skill, but to the broad public down on the ground, especially in my relevant to what I do, that knowledge and that understanding, that training is just not getting through.
All right, folks, we have 5 minutes. Thanks, everyone, for the questions. We're just about running out of time, and I'd just like to wind up a little bit, and we will get back to with those questions at the end. If I get anything, final words from each of you just before I sum up? Anyone want to go first?
Brian, I'll start. I think from everything that you've heard us talk about today, anyone who, even if they think they've got a solid cybersecurity program at their enterprise, has to look at these issues of industrial manslaughter, workplace accidents, and the connections to cybersecurity, and recognize that in this field, the ratchet of regulation is going to go up, not down. This isn't going to be a quick surge of interest where some regulators think, oh, perhaps we should pay more attention to this. As you can tell from Trevor's, Bill's, Brian's comments, the increasing attention that's just being given on a systemic basis by government authorities, by legislatures, indicates that the expectations of regulators and ultimately law enforcement people will only continue to rise for the foreseeable future, which makes it all the more important that boards and C-level officials take this connection very seriously and act proactively. Don't wait for the next case like the Brisbane Auto Supply case that occurred in Queensland, resulting in the first criminal verdict for these kinds of manslaughter situations to happen to your company. Assume that you need to get ahead of the curve, and that curve will be a risky curve to stay on if you think you can just stand pat with standard responses on the generic desire to maintain cybersecurity and to have good compliance. You know, saying we're doing well isn't enough anymore.
Thanks, John. Bill?
Yes. I think for everyone that has been listening and the fantastic questions, you're doing the right things. It's now just a matter of stepping up your game a little bit more. Focus on your internal team, focus on the teams that you support, focus on the organization, and then start to understand what is the external threat to the enterprise, and make sure that you have measures in place, remediations, programs to thwart those malevolent actors, those threat actors that would want to erase your ability to compete economically or from a intellectual property perspective, and make sure that the board of directors, to Trevor and Jonathan's point and to Brian's point as well, are aware of the initiatives to protect the enterprise against all these enemies, both foreign and domestic. Back over to you, sir.
Thanks, mate. Trev?
Yeah, pretty well. Individual risk, individual financial risk, company financial risk, company risk. The exposure today to companies, and what Bill touched on, the first industrial manslaughter prosecution in Queensland, there's been numerous matters under various category 1, 2, 3 prosecutions that have occurred, and many matters, but it's the individual financial risk and the failure not to act.
All right. Gentlemen, thank you very much. You know, I think in the ever-growing complexity of the modern world and comparable growth and sophistication of organised crime and threat actors, we have to enhance our resilience by building a trusted ecosystem of valued partners such as Nozomi, who are capable of protecting us tomorrow. We need to find ways to simplify our response to such growing complexity, but perhaps with this topic today, we need to take that first step to acknowledge the vulnerability of our critical OT and IoT environments. So again, thank everyone for participating. Thank you very much for Nozomi for the opportunity to share thoughts and try and influence tomorrow. And I'd also like to wish John and Bill a happy Thanksgiving tomorrow. And thanks, gentlemen, for your time. Thanks, Trev, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
John.
you.
Bye,
Cheers.
Bill. Bye, Brian.
Bye.
Bye-bye.